Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on this virtual program at the Tenement Museum. My name is SJ. I'm an educator at the museum, and I'm going to be leading the program today. I'm also joined by my colleague Laura in the chat, who will pass along any questions or curiosities you have throughout the program. At the Tenement Museum, we are a storytelling museum, and we're also one that really values engagement. So I absolutely want to know what you're thinking about throughout this program, the questions that are coming up. And I will also ask you questions sometimes too, but I never like asking questions that have one answer or a right or a wrong answer. But I'm going to share my screen to introduce you to the program that we are going to be going through tonight, piecing it together. For the next hour, we're going to be exploring the garment industry on the Lower East Side through the experiences of real families who have lived in our historic buildings. And we're going to start with the Rogarshevsky family. I'm an Eastern European Jewish family who worked in the garment industry in the 1910s. Then we are going to go into the 1980s to look at the story of the Wong family, a Chinese family who was in the industry around this period. And through their personal experiences, as well as in the context of the Wongs, hearing audio as well as videos of actual family members, we'll get a sense of this work through a family's navigation of it, looking at the factors that led them into the garment industry, both personal and what's happening around them, and also using this particular program as a moment to reflect, especially today on what is the 110th anniversary of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, to reflect on the voices that pushed for change, that pushed for advocating for workers, and where those voices and those conversations still echo in our current movements. But on the subject of work, the first sort of thing that I want to take us to is an opening question. And that question is, what makes a job a good job? I think it's always kind of an interesting thing to think about, especially in this world of work, or maybe we're reflecting on that more so. But it's going to be a question that we're also going to look at through our families about where they might be finding agency within this work, but also where those difficulties might lie too. But what we do at our museum is we share stories of families who lived in these two historic structures. They're really kind of the flagship of our storytelling. On the left is 97 Orchard, a tenement that was constructed in 1863 by a German immigrant named Lucas Glockner. It was one of the earliest tenements built on the block, and so it's in some ways reflective of that style. 5-story high brick building with metal fire escapes in the front and commercial spaces in the ground level. And this existed as a residence until 1935. Our other building, 103 Orchard or 81 Delancey, depending on the entrance you go in through, is another tenement that was built a little bit later in the 1880s and also existed as a residence into the early 2000s. And we estimate that across these two buildings, over the span that they are both existing as residences, around 15,000 people lived in them. Not all at the same time, but over the stretch of those decades. And it's those people and those families that we focus on. But before I go into the specifics of the family, I want to bring us into the neighborhood as well, to sort of look at the two Lower East Sides that we are going to be exploring. These are two images of the Lower East Side, one in the late 1890s and then one in the 1970s. So in the 1970s streetscape, we do see a street full of activity, right? People walking around, and also these older tenement buildings calling back to decades before. But one thing I think is really interesting to sort of pull out from this image is also the signage that we see, clothing signs, knitwear, lingerie, shoes. We have rugs, we have shirts hanging outside the front of these windows, in that this is a history of the Lower East Side that is one that is in some ways enduring. If we pan over to the 1890s photo, in some ways we are seeing a similar scene. There are vendors outside with push carts, but also clothing that is hanging in front of the awnings. We have storefronts selling trimmings for dresses and hats. And so this is an industry that has a long lifespan in the neighborhood from really the late 19th century up into the early 2000s. And I'm already seeing, kind of being passed along to me from Maria, a good job is personally satisfying. which I think is kind of interesting to think about, getting work that you feel a sort of satisfaction towards. It's not something that might be just based in survival. And we don't know for some of our families if this work was personally satisfying in other ways, but maybe we'll be able to kind of pull that apart in this narrative. This image of the Lower East Side is really depicting the neighborhood when it's going through a significant sort of population boom. By the late 19th century, this neighborhood is the central hub for the garment industry in the entire country, where by 1900, about 70% of all women's clothing and 40% of all men's sold all over the country is being made right here on the Lower East Side. And it's also coinciding with a period of immigration, where we're starting to see more Eastern European Jewish immigrants coming to the United States, and many of them settling here and calling the neighborhood home. And so we have a workforce that is arriving, and we have a job that requires a huge demand for labor. We would see the garment industry shift from going to a custom tailor who's making clothing set to your measurements to people buying clothes in department stores that have standardized sizing that's mass produced. And because there is mass production, you have to have a lot of people working within that production. And as a result, this was a pretty easy line of work for people who were just arriving to the country to enter into. Not everyone was coming with skill in the needle trades, but they would pick it up through that work. And I'm also seeing some other things coming through about what makes a good job a good job. One with an okay pay, right? It has to maybe give you enough to at least survive. And a good job also pays you enough to pay your bills and care for your family. So it's not just living paycheck to paycheck. One that pays well with respect and honor for the laborer. One that provides fair pay for one's time, expertise, and location. And so what I'm kind of pulling from this is this idea of like a personal satisfaction, personal fulfillment, but also that like you need to have enough to survive. And a good job brought up by Melanie is also one where you are working in safe conditions, right? That you feel safe going to work. And it's going to be the words of these workers across history that are going to try and create something like that. It feels like a place that is safe to go, a place that you can afford, your livelihood through that. But it takes a while for those changes to happen. And these are still, again, conversations that are happening today. If we're looking at the garment industry in the 1890s, about 60% of the wage earners in the neighborhood are working in this industry, but they're going to be working in conditions that look similar to this. This is an 1889 photograph of a factory within the neighborhood on Ludlow Street, taken by famous tenement photojournalist Jacob Riis. So we see a small room with 2 outward-facing windows and 6 employees, some of them blurred, rushing to get their contract done. This man in the front not paying the photographer any mind as he's working with those shears to make as many of these pieces as he possibly can. But also this young girl, looking at the novelty of a photographer coming into this space. And these factories were not dedicated spaces for labor. They weren't just being used as work. Between the 2 windows on the wall is a ketubah, right, a Jewish marriage contract that gives us an insight that this is not just a place where garments are being pieced together, this is a home. So in this period, manufacturers didn't rent out labor space. Contract laborers would instead piece together contracts within their home and kind of a network of factories. Or maybe in one apartment, someone is cutting the fabric that's going to be used. In another, maybe they're putting it together. In another, maybe they're making the boxes that are going to pack up those clothes and ship them across the country. But this was, for the first 2 decades or so of this mass-produced industry, the working condition. When we look at our first family on the tour who's involved in the garment work, they're coming at a period of great change. So the Rogarshevskys immigrate to the country in 1901. So they're arriving when the neighborhood does look very much like this. But by the 1910s, they're moving into an industry where there's going to be kind of a shift in what those working environments look like. So I want to bring us inside 97 Orchard to meet the Rogarshevskys. This is a family portrait of the Rogarshevsky family, but not all of them. So in the back row, we have the mother of our family, Fanny, with her boy on the young boy's shoulder, her hand there. To the left is her oldest son, Morris. To the right, one of her daughters, Bessie, one of her sons, Samuel. We haven't been able to identify these two children in the front, though we do know they are not family members. But the Rogarshevskys, by the time they lived in 97 Orchard, were a family of 8, consisting of the parents, Fanny and Abraham, and their 2 daughters, Ida and Bessie, and 4 boys, Morris, Sam, Henry, and Philip. And originally the family was from Telch, Lithuania, a fairly small town of about 3,000 people. Again, they immigrate in 1901, but they live in the neighborhood for about 9 years before finding a home in 97 Orchard. 4 of their children are going to be born in Telch and part of that immigration, and 2 more are going to be born here in New York. And the home that they set up looks a bit like this. And if you do sort of have any questions or reflections or reactions that are coming up, please feel free to stick them in the chat and they can just be passed along to me. But this is your typical tenement apartment in 97 Orchard. They all had the same layout of 3 rooms, about 325 square feet. So we're standing in the parlor or the living room, which in some ways was thought to be one of the best rooms in the house because it had these outward facing windows that let natural daylight in. Through an interior window, we can start to see the kitchen. And then if you can see that smaller window through the interior window, there's also a little bedroom over there. And so the family does have to negotiate a lot of space here. This parlor is sometimes used as a bedroom for the 4 boys. The girls sleep in the kitchen, but it is just a home. So in contrast to that Jacob Riis photograph that was also taken in someone's parlor, this is not a space that is being used for work. But I do want to take a look at the working life of this family. How we know a lot about them is from a census record. So this is a portion of the 1910 census. I'm not going to make you try to read this one. It is impossible, but we have typed it out for ease of reading. And I'm curious in looking at this census, what it can tell you about the working lives of this family. What sort of information is standing out to you? What questions is it bringing up? What sort of inferences might you be drawing by looking at this information? The family is highlighted in yellow here. So again, we have Abraham, Rogarshevsky, Fanny, teenage daughters, Ida and Bessie, Morris, teenage son, and then their younger children, Samuel, Henry, and Philip, with their 2 sons being, 3 and 7 years old. Questions along the top are speaking to what the 1910 census is asking you, ranging from the name to the relation in the family to where they were born. We have questions about infant mortality, questions about immigration. But I do want to kind of focus on this industry, right? The nature of their work, what we're sort of seeing. And I'm going to be quiet for like 30 seconds, just to give you time to read it over and sort of send some thoughts in. So I'm already seeing from Sarah coming in, several family members worked in the garment industry. So yeah, when we're looking at the Rogarshevskys, pretty much everyone in the family who is employed are working in the garment industry. Abraham is listed as a presser, meaning he would be ironing out the completed clothes in a garment shop before it's sent to the manufacturer. Bessie is putting together paper boxes, which very well may be used in the garment industry to pack those clothes. Bessie is listed as a sewing machine operator, right, working in a ladies' waist shop, and Morris as a shipping clerk working in a laundry. And so we do see their experience is kind of reflective of many families in this period working within garments. And a question from Chibi Life of how many people lived in a tenement. This particular building, when it was constructed, could house 22 families. So there are 4 apartments on each floor of the 5-story building. There would be 2 apartments within the basement as well, which on average is about 100 people at any given time. When the Rogarshevskys were living here, the building was at its most crowded at about 100 people. And their family size was also the sort of average family size you'd see in this period of about 6 to 8 people. And I'm also seeing an observation too of the census tells us how hard their lives are. And I am curious kind of what is giving you a sense of a hard life from this document. Beryl bringing in the idea of unskilled labor. which I think is also interesting to think about, like, what is the difference between unskilled labor and skilled labor? How is that being sort of perceived? And even looking kind of beyond the Rogarshevskys, we also see, several other tailors as well. And so their story is not necessarily unique in the neighborhood. The challenge with the garment industry was it wasn't always stable work. In some cases, it was very seasonal, depending on the contract and the demand for the seasons. So if you were making winter coats, for instance, you're not going to have employment in the winter. The coats are made. And I'm seeing this question of, was the father out of work for a time? So that's kind of giving us this sense, right, that this might be a challenge for the family. Where in the column of numbers of week out of work, we see that Abraham has been unemployed for 13 weeks, over 3 months. So this is a significant span of time to be without work. And we don't know specifically why he might be facing unemployment, but there are a few reasons. It says his industry is clothing shop, so it's not designated as a factory. It could be a larger factory, but it could also have been one of those home factories in the neighborhood that have only like 3 to 6 employees where he's working as a presser. And while those factories were challenging as far as you're not making a lot of money, you're paid by the piece, it's crowded, it's hot, it's going to be long hours, there was some benefit to them in the flexibility they afforded both the bosses as well as the workers as far as when they were working. A lot of people within the garment industry in this period were Jewish immigrants. And at this point, in a lot of industries, the American work week was Monday to Saturday. But in one of these smaller run shops, led by a Jewish boss perhaps, a lot of times we see factories opting to take Saturday off to observe Shabbat and work on Sunday to stay competitive. From what we know about the family, going by what specifically Henry, their younger son, told us in interviews when he was in his 90s, we know that both Fanny and Abraham were religious. And so maybe Abraham doesn't want to compromise that aspect of his identity in finding a work in one of these larger factories that are developing that are requiring him to work on Saturday. A lot of those larger factories too are not hiring 39-year-old Abraham. They're usually hiring teenage girls around assumptions they can pay them less, around assumptions that they are basically living at home and should not get a higher wage. And adding to that, we will see that Abraham will pass away of tuberculosis in 1918. And we don't know when he contracted tuberculosis, but it can be a very lingering illness. And so at this point, he might be having health challenges that lead to him having a hard time finding regular work. And I also see Louise pointing out infant mortality too, in that we do see that this family has experienced loss as well within their children, where 8 children were born, but only 6 are alive. We don't know very much about the 2 children who were lost, but we do know that they were infants and that they died in their hometown in Telch rather than in New York. But these sort of numbers, right, that are collapsed in a sterile government document can speak to that greater emotional weight that the family might be going through, whether it is infant mortality or struggling with unemployment. With Abraham out of work, the reality might be that their teenage children are supporting the family economy. In this period, from the ages of 8 to 14, that was the mandated stretch of time when you had to go to public school. You could start earlier and you could stay later, but once you turn 14, you could get your working papers. And so we see all of their kids over the age of 14, Morris at 15, Bessie at 16, Ida at 17 are all employed within the garment industry and adjacent industries. And so that might be a lot of pressure on the kids too, that you might be responsible for bringing in enough money for rent, enough money for food. Fanny is going to be managing that family economy. And I want to look at the world of work specifically through Bessie working as a sewing machine operator, to sort of explore the environment that she might be working in. We don't know what factory she was working in. And while there were some smaller ones in the neighborhood, at this point, there's also a building boom where there are all these steel framed high-rise buildings going up around the East 20s, East 30s. those are starting to be rented out for labor space instead, in part because they have electricity. And so they can adapt new technology, specifically the electric sewing machine, where you can produce a lot more, a lot faster. Whereas in 97 Orchard and many tenements like it, they won't get electricity to the 1920s or so. So they can't adapt that new technology. And so Bessie may very well be getting on the train behind her building and going uptown for a nickel to work in one of these larger factories. And this is a video from 1904, showing young women entering into the working world. It's not in a garment factory, it's in Westinghouse Electric Company, so it's a little bit of a different dynamic, but it can still give us a sense. And so Bessie is going to be entering into the workforce among her peer group, right? Among a lot of other young women, mostly teenagers, young adults. And the question I want to pose to you as we see, 200 girls clock in is, what do you think they talk about as they're sitting at the sewing machine for hours a day? What are some of the things they might be discussing with their peers, or conversations they might be having? Within garment factories, while there were some men who were working as sewing machine operators, again, the larger body of workforce were for teenage girls. And that was partly around the kind of work that was open to men and women at this point, where families would sometimes prioritize the education of their younger sons. Maybe Henry and Samuel go past the age of 14. Maybe they go to high school, they go to university. Whereas with a lot of the daughters, there was the assumption that they were going to be getting married, right? And that they're only going to have a few years within the workforce. And so there was a notion that once you turn 14, you enter the workforce, you make money for your family in those few years that you have. And a lot of factory owners were also prioritizing the hiring of young women, again, around assumptions that they are working at home, and therefore their wages do not necessarily have to be living wages, so to speak. And so they're not going to necessarily be bringing a lot of money into the home. But as these girls walk by, any ideas about what they're talking about? I'm seeing Gaylord bring up boys. Yeah, like maybe you're talking about boys right next to you. The cost of living, activities after work are sort of coming up too. I always think like your parents aren't in the garment factory, whereas in a smaller factory in the neighborhood, maybe they know your mom. The factory owners here don't know your mom. So maybe there's some more freedom what you talk about, right? Maybe you're thinking about what you want to do after work. You want to go to Coney Island. The train is right there. You want to go to a dance hall. Maybe you discuss the plot of the latest dime novel that's come out. I also see Claudia mentioning, I used to work on an assembly line as a young woman. We used to sing, which I think is absolutely beautiful. Within these spaces, there were girls that would be singing, usually kind of the pop culture songs of the day, but music might be a component you're absolutely hearing in here to pass away the time. And this observation of it must have been so loud in many factories. Absolutely. I mean, if we think about what these factories look like, I'll take us back to give us a view of that these are going to be very loud spaces. Maybe you're not talking very much. Or as BT mentioned, maybe you're talking about your employers too. This is an interior of a 1910s factory, which is kind of what you would see in a typical factory in the period. There would usually be about 200 sewing machines on a floor, and again, they are electric. So you're going to hear all of the sounds of these electric sewing machines whirring. You're going to hear these conversations. I also see some more things about what they're talking about coming through. Maybe each other. They were probably in groups and out groups. So yeah, maybe you're gossiping. You're kind of forging connections with some of your coworkers, not with your others. Maybe you're talking about your neighbors, as Jody's bringing up, because you're also going outside your neighborhood here. Bessie is not just going to be encountering, other Jewish teenagers that she saw in the building at 97. She's going to be meeting Italian girls. You're going to hear English being spoken in here, people from all of these different backgrounds entering the labor force, that she's also going to be exposed to a wider peer group. But the conditions in here are going to be particularly challenging. She would work a 6-day work week and would have to work through Saturday. So for her families who are observing the Sabbath, that might become a point of conflict, perhaps, or anxiety. It was on average a 10-hour workday, but depending on the demand for the seasons, it could be up to 12 or 14 hours. And you're paid by the piece. So you're paid by how many shirtwaists you make rather than how long it takes to make them. And so Bessie's probably going to be making as many shirts as she possibly can within that stretch of her day, which would sometimes range from 8 a.m. to 10 p.m. And if you mess up one shirt, you don't get paid for it. Maybe she hears that one of her coworkers messed up 3 shirts and has lost her job. Reports from factory girls in the 1910s talk about their pay being docked because they tucked their foot under them while they were sewing because their foot got tired, or that sometimes they would have to buy or rent their own machines. If a needle broke, you might have to pay for those broken materials. In some spaces, if you want to sit at your sewing machine, you had to rent your own chair to do it. And so there's going to also be a lot of contention in these spaces. On a good week, you might take home $5 a week, and you don't get to save that money. That money goes directly back into your family's economy. But because of the structure of these factories, in contrast, those smaller home shops, because there is this large workforce that can talk to each other, there was this ability to organize, right? And this growing movement to organize. There's a question coming in of how much money do they usually make? It really depended based off the contract. Because you're paid by the piece, if you're making a more complicated garment like a suit, that might harm your wages. Whereas if you're making something that you know a lot of, you have the muscle memory for, it might make more. But $5 to $6 was considered, a good week for them. But in this period, we start to see people coming together saying that is not a living wage. We start to see unions coming together and talking about how these conditions have to change. And so these spaces engender the formation of unions. Some of the early ones that emerge in this period first is the International Ladies Garment Workers Union that starts in 1900. This is a picture of several of the union members standing outside Lyceum Hall. It was a labor hall on a strike. And the ILGWU first started as a convening of labor leaders, all of whom were white men and who are coming from trades that were considered more skilled trades. So they're making cloaks, they're making suits. At this point, young women making shirtwaists were seen as unskilled trades, and they were largely left out of that early conversation. There was some elements of exclusion in the formation of these unions to begin with. In this period as well, there are small but growing numbers of Black women entering the needle trades too. Both African-American migrants coming up from the South, as well as immigrants from the West Indies, who are largely shut out by the ILGWU. And we're also going to see women in general being shut out too. But the specific Local 25 is going to gain many more female members than other unions. And so there's also going to be this growing body that is being supported by the ILGWU. And it wasn't, a big union to begin with. It didn't have a large bargaining unit, but oftentimes members would stand outside these large factories and say, do you work here? Here's some information on our union. Here is this meeting at Lyceum Hall, come and learn about it. And so there was this kind of recruiting on an individual level done by women within this organization. Another significant union that came up in 1903 was the Women's Trade Union League, that was first formed out of initial frustrations that the ILGW didn't have a lot of women leading it. And this is their seal that speaks to some of the things that they were trying to get. So they were trying to get an 8-hour workday, a living wage, meaning they were backing the creation of minimum wage laws. This idea of guarding the home, of having a work and a home life balance, of abolishing child labor. These were a lot of the issues that the Women's Trade Union League was emphasizing. And a lot of the members of this were wealthier women who weren't working in garment factories. And so a lot of the work that they did around these conversations was doing fundraisers to support strikes, boycotting certain manufacturers, as well as standing outside during strikes to make sure that no illegal arrests were happening. And so these organizations are going to come together and they're going to start to grow in membership. But a lot of the women who are joining it are still a sort of overlooked body within the labor movement. It's seen that they don't have a lot to maybe contribute to that movement. But that is going to be ultimately challenged in 1909 because the people who are going to be leading the charge of bringing about changes in these conditions are going to be teenagers. They're going to be young women. And one of those notable figures was Clara Lemlich, pictured on the left here. She was an Eastern European Jewish immigrant who was working within the garment industry. She was working as a sewing machine operator, and she was also part of the ILGWU. And in November of 1909, she joined a meeting at Cooper Union, which was a convening of all of these, again, high-powered labor leaders. And the meeting was called to have a conversation about whether or not there should be a general strike. And it seemed like the consensus was moving away from a strike. There was a concern that a strike would be too risky, that change should be brought about in maybe a more moderate fashion. And frustrated with this girl stands up and she says in Yiddish, "I have something to say. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. I am one of those who suffers from the abuses described here. And I move that we go on general strike." And we don't know, if Bessie Rogarshevsky was at that meeting, but for girls like her, or even if she was standing there, seeing someone like you stand up while this conversation is happening and say in your native language, enough with these conversations, that we have to have forward movement and action, would have galvanized a huge movement. And Clara's words after that sparked the largest strike to women up to that point, where 20,000 women leave their factories. It's 20,000 out of 30,000 of the workforce within this industry. They leave their factories to try and pressure them to bring about some change, specifically a cap on how many hours you're working every single week. They wanted a 52-hour maximum, but they wanted higher wages for the clothes that they were making. Some of you are mentioning, safety provisions. They wanted a safe work environment. And they also wanted these factories to recognize the union and to hire union members. On the right, we have an image of some of the ILGW picketers wearing sashes across their shoulders, as well as these gigantic hats. And one of the hinges of Clara's speech was that girls in the factory don't have a clean place to hang their hats when they come to work. And she said, those hats, we have saved up for weeks to get those hats, going on nothing but dry cakes for 2 weeks as we save up. And in some ways, they're taking up space, right? There's a big visual sort of symbolism within those hats. But by saving up for them, by wearing them, by customizing them, it was also showing a message that their labor that had been so devalued in these factories had value. But also this message that they have a life outside the factory, that they have a life outside the work. And this strike lasts 3 months. It shuts down the garment industry for 3 months. And it sends a message that women workers who had been so overlooked did have a huge power in pushing for that change. Some of the factories did take back the women on their terms, specifically a cap on working hours and for increased wages about 15 or 20%. But they didn't recognize safety provisions, and many of them did not recognize the union as a bargaining unit. And so it was a struggle that was not over. But Clara and the uprising of 20,000, which is what this event was called, ended up sparking a huge movement throughout the 1910s as more and more workers started to organize and also push for those conditions. Within a few months of the breaking of the 1909 strike, we would see another strike happen in July of that year, where 60,000 cloak makers would also leave their factories to petition to have similar things. And because someone mentioned songs and music in the factory, I do want to play a portion of a song that came out around this period. It was from a Yiddish broadside that spoke specifically about the cloakmaker strike. And it's performed by a historian named James Petler, who did the research for it. So I'm just going to play it, take a look at the lyrics, and it will tell you a little bit about the outcome of this particular movement.
But Tante sie jeden von Kind bis und Segen der Streik, was hat sich gemacht? Die Cloakmakers viele, die brave, die stille, gestreikt haben sie Wochen 8. Sehr Schmerzen und Wehen und ja mehr Geschreien hat man jahrelang nie gehört. Und plötzlich im Hurra vor dem 5. Juli, ein Streik haben sie Gold erklärt. Ja, der Streik, der größere Cloakmaker-Streik. Gekost viel Geld hat jeder Balleboss, am Ende geblieben sind sie mit an Nuss. Ja, der Streik, gedauert hat 8 Wochen Zeit. Die Bosses Association hat gekriegen Vacation, ja, durch den Cloakmaker-Streik.
I think within that there is this really sort of like buoyant victory that comes from it. I imagine it may have been something that people sort of knew the lyrics to, that they're maybe singing in the streets as a result of a strike that had a huge impact and would pave the way for others to follow. But at the same time, for the successes that many of these strikes made, again, largely around a cap on working hours and for higher wages, the unions were still considered fairly weak. They still didn't seem to have a lot of bargaining power with these larger factories. And for people like Bessie, who might be going on strike, who might have this connection with their peers and maybe even the support of their families, if you are bringing in the money for your family, there's only so long you can go without a wage. And even as the Women's Trade Union League is raising funds to try and support strikers, it is not as much as a wage. And so a lot of women would have to go back into some of the conditions that they had fought against because of the economic factors. And this question from Amy Bernstein, this strange turn of phrase of left with a nose, it's a strange like idiom that meant that they were kind of disgruntled and left with nothing. The Bosses Association was basically this protective agency that the factory owners formed in response to strikes, where basically all of these factory owners said that if the union is going to tell us how to run our shops, it is going to be a long and bitter battle, and we are prepared to go down in ruin. And so while there are some factories accepting this term, it speaks to the fact that there are many factories that were not. And the factory that Clara was working at, and the factory that was seen as a focal point for all of these conversations in the early 1900s, was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And the tragedy of that is within a year of the cloakmaker strike, within less than 2 years of the uprising of 20,000, there is going to be a devastating fire that happens here. It will largely be a result of unsafe working conditions, where fire escapes were never inspected to be load bearing. And it's going to happen about 15 minutes to the end of the day on Saturday of March 25th, 1911. Girls come out onto the windows, out into the fire escapes to try and flee, but the fire escapes tear from the walls. There are instances of some doors being locked in part to keep employees from going out on frequent breaks or to keep labor organizers out. And those that weren't unlocked opened inwards, so it was very difficult to get out of the building. Elevator operators tried to operate the elevator as much as possible through the flames, but eventually the actual structure of it got overwhelmed and it couldn't carry people up and down the floors any longer. And while the fire department did arrive quickly, the building that this fire took place in is 10 stories high. The factory was on the 8th, 9th, and 10th floor. And so the technology that had built these buildings outpaced the technology the fire departments had. The ladders could only reach up to the 7th floor, and the water could not effectively get up to those higher floors as well. Those on the 10th floor, many of them were able to escape onto the roof. Some of them were actually helped by neighboring NYU students. But we also see that 146 people, especially on the 9th floor, are going to pass away as a result of the fire itself or from jumping to escape the flames. And I see a question from Virginia as well of, was there any violence against strikers? That was answered in the chat. We were seeing violence against strikers up to this point as well, both at the hands of people hired by the bosses to intimidate strikers, as well as at the hands of police. And so that culminating violence is also going to, in some ways, come to what happens at Triangle. And Gales bring up a comment of course, being female, they would not have been taken so seriously. That's one of the reasons why we see, like, while the uprising of 20,000 sparks this huge movement, the cloakmaker strike got much more attention because many of those strikers were men. And with the deaths caused by the Triangle Fire, 23 of them, of the 146 were men, but everyone else was women and mostly these young girls. But the gender of those who had died was in some ways obscured in reports of the loss of this factory. What happens afterwards is this is going to be an event that reverberates throughout the neighborhood on the Lower East Side. While the Rogarshevsky children were not working in this factory, they probably know someone who was. And so there is going to be a sorrow that is going to permeate this neighborhood. But there's also going to be an outrage as well from people who had been trying to bring awareness to these conditions well before this tragedy. There are going to be public funerals held in the street for those who had passed away that are not only mourning that loss, but asking those who had had the power to make those changes, where were you when we were calling for this in the years before? And also challenging the city to not let something like this happen again. Immediately after the fire, the Women's Trade Union League met with civic and labor leaders to start drawing up legislation to improve fire safety within these buildings. Commissions were formed to inspect factories to make sure that those safety provisions were being upheld. But at the same time, at these meetings, memorials that were held in front of influential New Yorkers, a lot of the garment workers put those New Yorkers to task, saying, we were trying to bring awareness this before. And this is a movement that is in some ways kind of sparking others. I do see your question, Barbara, of if this tied in with suffragist demonstrations as well. Absolutely. I mean, in this period, we see people fighting for change across numerous platforms, not only for safety protections, for working protections, but also for the right to vote. We also see huge movements around, access to birth control. And so this is going to be part of a much wider conversation of people advocating for themselves and advocating for safer conditions, as well as agency and rights. And the aftermath of the Triangle, as far as the factory owners are concerned, is they technically were not convicted of any crime. They were charged for second and third degree manslaughter, but were ruled as having broken no laws. But it does spark a huge call for reform and improving factory conditions and workers' rights. And it's also an event that is never forgotten. The ILGW works very hard to keep this in the public memory as a warning and as a challenge to never have a catalyst like this take place again. One ILGWU member and labor leader, Fania Cohn, in 1934 spoke about the best memorial for our martyrs of the Triangle Fire and the many others who sacrificed their health and very lives in their effort to build our union is a resolve to continue our efforts to have the workers more strongly united in economic and political fields, coupled with a workers' education movement that would help create a new environment lending itself to fundamental political, social, and economic changes dictated by working class needs. And so this particular moment is going to be invoked every single year as a call for a greater need for unionization as well. And once we come into the 1930s, we are going to see the ILGWU and other unions really gain in power and in membership. Within our own building, we are going to have a woman named Rosaria Baldizzi enter the ILGWU. By the 1940s, another family member within our buildings, Ramonita Velez from Puerto Rico, is also going to become an ILGW member. As membership gains, the materials printed by the ILGW are going to change. The language is going to shift from English, Italian, and Yiddish to English, Spanish, and Chinese. And once we come into the 1980s, we're also going to see Mrs. Wong's experience as she enters into a union that has a support network for her. In the 1910s, it was a fight, right? It was people who were working to kind of lay the foundation that was going to lead to a system that will bring in benefits, it will bring in a network of support that Mrs. Wong and other workers like her are going to draw upon in the 1980s. but that groundwork is going to continue to be laid by workers in that period as well, building upon what had come before. And so I do want to take us out of the 1910s to look at the experiences of the Wong family. This is a photograph of Mrs. Wong with 3 out of her 4 children. She and her husband, Mr. Wong, were originally from Taishan in southern China, and she came to the Lower East Side in 1965 to be reunited with her husband, who had come shortly before. And when she makes that journey, she has 2 daughters, Yaping here, who is 7 in that period, and Allison, who's a newborn baby. And then by the time she's in New York, she and Mr. Wong are going to have 2 more children, another daughter named Tony and a son named Kevin. And at first, when they live in the neighborhood, they're in a 1-bedroom on Hester Street. But by 1968, they move into 103 Orchard and create a home there. We have reconstructed just a part of their home. So this is the bedroom of the daughters. But Mrs. Wong learns about the building from a family friend, the Zhao family. And she's one of the first Chinese immigrants to move into the building. And so she's coming into the building at a time when there is a significant change in the neighborhood as far as who is calling it home. 1965 is a pivotal year for immigration law in the country, because that is when a law is passed called the Hart-Celler Act, that essentially did away with decades of country-specific and racial-specific quotas, barring who could immigrate into the country and who could not, to create more or less a global quota similar to what is used today. For Chinese immigration specifically, by the time we get to 1882, there is a federal ban that bars the immigration of anyone who is ethnically Chinese unless you hold certain occupations. So it was one that was found in both racism and classism. But what the Hart-Celler Act does is it does away with that ban, and people who had been historically barred from entering the country can come again. And so Mrs. Wong is going to be coming into a neighborhood that not only has a growing Chinese population, but we're also going to be seeing Dominican immigrants in this period as well. There also would have been a Puerto Rican migration happening in the decades that followed that was bringing new life into a neighborhood that had largely been experiencing a population decline as immigration laws got more restrictive. And so she's coming into a Lower East Side that is going to be having more activity. And we talked to largely the children about their memories of the neighborhood in this period. And a lot of their stories focus on school and work and the games that they would play, but they also recalled the working lives of their parents. Mr. Wong, they remembered him being tired a lot, largely because he had to wake up very early in the morning to work at a laundromat in Union Square. And then he later would enter into the restaurant industry. And these were both 2 industries that historically did not really have any unionization or any benefits that came with them. And so Mrs. Wong enters the workforce as well to alleviate some of those burdens. But while she goes into the garment industry, she did not know how to sew. She had grown up on a farm in Taishan, and so her skill was agriculture. And as a result, she's entering into this brand new foray. But I want to play a video from her where she talks about some of her first days at the sewing machine and learning to sew.
我乜第一次學車衣啊，本來唔識咧，有啲人唔中意啦嘛，咁嗰間衣廠冇乜緊要啊，你嚟學咯咁。我咪學下咪自己識車咯，識車又3蚊啊，歡喜，好似幾個先咋一條好似，我唔記得幾多，總之好少錢一條啊。 咁自己嚟歡喜咯，係啊，咁啊歡喜咯，咁歡喜啊，自己學識啊，以後自己識啦嘛，識做啊嘛，識買車啊嘛，咁嗰陣時啊嘛。
So her story is sort of like that opening entrance into an industry that she doesn't really have any familiarity with, and this pride, right, in making a piece where there's not a lot of money in it, the wages are slim, but that she now is sort of a primary wage earner in the home that's going to sort of change the family dynamics as well. But her children recall that within a few months of working in the industry, she joins the union, specifically again, ILGW, Local 25, at the guidance of her friends. And so I want to take us into the factory as it would have been when she is here. And I also see, Carol, that you taught at PS 42 on Hester Street, and I think the older daughter was in my class. Very likely, the Wong children did go to PS 42, so it's always lovely when we do have this neighborhood connection. So the factory, this is a representation of a factory in the neighborhood in the 1980s, but it's about 1/10 of the size of what the smallest would be. So it's very much downscaled. But within this factory, we're also seeing the garment industry kind of picking up in the neighborhood in ways that it's declining in the rest of the country. Where as we have more highways and as we have more globalization, a lot of clothing is being produced all across the United States as well as across the ocean. But because loft space was relatively affordable in the neighborhood in this period, and because there were more people who were moving into the neighborhood and had this larger workforce, New York really stayed relevant in the fashion world, even as other places it was starting to fall away. But the logistics of the garment factory, I want to share with you through a video where you'll be able to hear some of the voices of people who were involved within that industry. In the 1980s, what New York was mostly known for was producing sportswear. So the kind of garments that we see on the right, these sort of mix and match patterns you'd buy off a rack, largely for kind of the middle class woman entering the workforce. But here's a video that explains a little bit about the logistics in Mrs. Wong's shop.
Most people who worked in the factories worked on piece rate. That is a system where you are paid a certain amount of money for every job task that you do. So for example, if you sewed zippers, you might get paid 4 cents a zipper. And if you sewed 2 zippers, then you would get paid 8 cents. Well, you just keep on sewing more and more and more zippers, and pretty soon you'll have a wage.
By the high season, there are lots of tons of garment arriving to our shop and piling high, and we are very proud and very happy when the garment come, the same style, the same work, the same, the style I'm talking about, no chains. That's the time we call them in Chinese 小弟.
We called this soy sauce chicken. In other words, it was sweet and tasty, and we could make a lot of money. So that's what good piece rates did. On the other hand, low piece rates meant that we would not make very much money, even below minimum wage. And so if we had to work on low piece rate items, it literally meant that we would take home less.
This is the work of the boss, the person that's going to get the garment. You look at it, you know how difficult or how easy the garment is going to be. And you also look at the quantity of the garment. Once I got a big contract from Walmart to make one style for 1.3 or 1.4 million pieces of garment. One style. My girl, they close their eyes and make it that fast.
That video is just sort of exploring some of the logistics of the industry at this point. And I do see your question, Gail, of was there pressure on the women to join the union at that time? In this period, there was a lot more organizing that was happening. Like Katie Kwan in that video worked as a labor organizer, where she would go to all of these shops to try and garner support and have people join the union and sort of hear about the benefits that would come with it. And I kind of think about the difference of the time period in 1980 versus 1910, in that one of the reasons why there was a lot of union membership happening in this period was because of the benefits that would come with it. Many women were entering into the industry in this period because of the health benefits that would come from the union, that in the case of families like the Wongs, the husbands didn't have the health benefits. And so you're kind of combining those two wages with the benefits to create a living wage. And this kind of union board can show some more of those things that would really bring people to the industry. It's not the best quality photograph. But there was education. So you could go for English classes, you could go for classes on citizenship. There were classes that taught about the history of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire and labor history. Again, you have medical programs. And so there were a lot of reasons why women would join the union versus I think in the 1910s, where when you join, you're not going to be getting healthcare, right? You're not going to be getting, counseling. You're not going to have these benefits. It's going to be rather part of a movement trying to create that. Or maybe there was more pressure felt in that time period that everyone has to be in it together to build something. Whereas at this point, while there might be some pressure among employees, there's also a huge draw because of what the union could do for you. And in addition to things like healthcare was also, a space for socializing. This is a photograph of Mrs. Wong and Yaping and Kevin at Niagara Falls on a trip that was sponsored by the union. And so this is a place where you're also going to be meeting workers in other factories in a more informal setting. You're going to be making friends, so it will have that social component as well. But through the friendships that are forged, there's also going to be a solidarity when the time comes to advocate for more change. And that is going to be something that happens during Mrs. Wong's experience in the union too. In 1982, there's going to be one of the largest strike of garment workers that Chinatown has seen, where, again, kind of calling back to the uprising of 20,000 workers and supporters fill Columbus Park. And the reason they are striking is there was a negotiation between the union and many factory bosses, and the factory bosses would not sign. Partly because the negotiation was requesting that they pay for holiday time when they want the union to pay for it. They wanted to hire non-union workers when that was not part of the provision. And a lot of women in the industry also had their own requests that were not being made by the owners, largely around childcare. And so 20,000 garment workers take to the streets to pressure those factory owners. And again, we can kind of see who is in the industry in this period, where we have signs in English and Chinese and Spanish. This was going to be something that was going to spread beyond Columbus Park as well. People are going to be calling each other on the phones talking about it. They're going to be talking about it on the subways and at the markets. And the pressure basically leads the factory owners to sign the contract within a few hours. And the president of the ILGWU at that point called this one of the greatest victories in American trade unionism. And so even when there are benefits, there are still things that people are fighting for that call upon that legacy. But Mrs. Wong's work and how it is remembered in the family is kind of the last thing I want to take us to. She, through her work, was able to fund the college education of her children. And so these are photographs of Yaping, Allison, and Kevin at each of their college graduations. And Mrs. Wong is wearing a dress that she wore, the same one to each of those. But I want to play Yaping's sort of interpretation of her mother's working life and what it was like within the garment industry before we kind of open up for any last reflections. There she is.
Yaping considers her mother's work.
She did quite well in the sewing factory. She worked many years there, joined the union, and then to get to that point where she could be a sample maker for the other co-workers to emulate. I think my mom feels good about the money that she makes. That I think she would feel empowered by, that she's bringing in money to feed the family, and that she could get money to spend for herself. But she had no other choice to make a living. That was not empowering. And I feel kind of proud of her being such a good seamstress, although I never said that to her. Maybe I should now that I think about it. Yeah, I think I am proud of her achievements.
So Yaping is kind of pulling on these different ideas of, yes, there are these moments of pride and agency within the work, but there was also difficulty in that, she didn't have a choice sort of to enter that work. And Mrs. Wong's reflections on it was that she didn't feel that her work in the garment industry changed her as a person, but that it allowed her to do things. It allowed her to have enough money to pay for their apartment, to pay for food, but also have spending money for herself. And that it would also have, money to kind of put towards her children. But it's not a conversation that is locked in the past or in any one given family or window of time. These conversations continue to happen today, and the sort of groundwork that was laid by those who came before is built upon in our present, and is built upon in looking towards our future as well. And so maybe something to just kind of reflect upon in the current moment is, how has the world of work changed in this time, and what has sort of driven that change? A lot of the same voices and the same stories that we see are continuing ones. And that's what we like to look at our museum. But because we only have 1 minute left, I do want to thank all of you for joining us tonight on this program, and for all of your wonderful insights and your questions. We do hope that you're able to stay in touch with us at the museum as well. And we like to be able to offer these programs continually. Usually we do charge about $25 for these programs, but if you did enjoy it, we would greatly appreciate a donation. Usually suggest about $10, but your coming to these really keep our museum alive and keep us able to continue telling these stories. So thank you again so much, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.